For most of my life, the version of Native American history I was taught felt incomplete, polished, softened, almost myth-like. It was the kind of narrative that showed noble chiefs, peaceful villages, and a perfect harmony with nature, only to be shattered when Europeans arrived with violence, greed, and disease. That's the story our schools repeat. That's the storyline Hollywood replays over and over. And in a strange way, that version of history gives people a sense of moral clarity, even comfort. Because if we feel guilty, we feel like we understand. But the truth is far more complex, far deeper than that simplified tale. Indigenous nations once thrived across the continent, shaping the land, waging wars, building cultures, and enduring struggles long before European contact. And today, those once powerful nations make up only a small percentage of the population, living in scattered communities and wrestling with the weight of historical trauma and modern challenges. The scale of their loss is undeniable, and the story of their near erasure carries a gravity that goes beyond any single word, even the word genocide. But when I finally dug into the real history of warfare on this continent, that neat good guys versus villains narrative started to fall apart. The more I learned, the clearer it became that scalping, torture, and the destruction of entire villages weren't inventions brought over on European ships. Those brutal realities were already part of the landscape long before the first sails appeared on the horizon. North America was not a peaceful paradise. It was a world shaped by rivalries, shifting alliances, and cycles of violence. That doesn't excuse or rewrite what European colonists did. It certainly doesn't crown them as heroes. If anything, it makes the story even darker. The frontier became a collision zone between two unforgiving systems, each capable of unimaginable cruelty, fueling generations of raids, reprisals, and massacres. In the end, no side walked away clean, and the land itself became witness to bloodshed that reshaped the continent forever. I run Echoes Beneath, a channel dedicated to exploring the parts of history most people look away from. The stories that get softened, sanitized, or reshaped until they barely resemble the truth. I focus on the cracks in the official narrative, the places where reality slips through and challenges the versions we were taught to accept. And when I uncover something uncomfortable, I bring it here, not to crown heroes or create villains, but to dig deeper into what really happened. History is messy, complicated, and often painful, but that's exactly why it matters. So let's dive in and peel back the layers, together. We'll begin by looking at North America before Columbus arrived. Then we'll examine the conflicting values and opposing codes of warfare. And if you want to grasp how terrifyingly powerful native warfare could be, you have to study the Comanche. So dominant that a U.S. general once said fighting them would lead to absolute devastation. Finally, we'll explore how both sides contributed to the bloodshed. Quick pause before we continue. Tell us where in the world you're watching from. If you're enjoying this story, make sure to hit the subscribe button and don't forget to like and share. Now, let's dive back into the story. So how violent was North America before European contact? By today's standards, unimaginably savage. We grow up imagining indigenous life as buffalo hunts, corn harvests, and maybe an occasional conflict with neighboring tribes. But for many nations, violence wasn't an exception, it was the norm. Warfare was how young men proved themselves. If you grew up on the plains, adulthood wasn't marked by farming or house building. You became a man by joining a raiding party and taking scalps. That was your resume. That's how you earned prestige, secured a wife, and built a reputation. Violence wasn't a desperate last option. It was social capital. And these raids weren't once-in-a-while events. They happened frequently, sometimes every week during the raiding season. Captives, depending on their age and gender, might be adopted into the tribe or forced into brutal slavery, or be tortured to death in ceremonies so gruesome they'd make you sick. Some prisoners were burned alive. Others had their fingers removed one at a time. Some had to run gauntlets while every villager beat them as they sprinted past. To us, this looks monstrous. To them, it was a cultural rite, a trial of courage for both the captive and the community. Scalping is a perfect example. Many people claim Europeans introduced it. They didn't. They certainly used it, but the practice existed for centuries before their arrival. A scalp wasn't just evidence of a kill, it was a trophy to dance with, display, or use ceremonially. The goal wasn't merely killing an enemy, it was shaming them in a way that held meaning within the tribe. And warriors didn't restrict scalping to warriors. Taking the scalp of a woman or child demonstrated you had pierced deep into enemy territory and reached the inner heart of the village. In a culture built around bravery, that made you a legend. At Crow Creek, present-day South Dakota, archaeologists uncovered the remains of nearly 500 villagers killed in the early 1300s. Almost every skull showed signs of scalping. Torture was equally common. It wasn't about punishment. It was ritualized warfare. Captured enemies, especially rival warriors, were subjected to public torture ceremonies that could last hours or even days. Women slashed them with knives. Children hurled burning coals. A prisoner who remained stoic through the agony gained respect, even admiration. Violence was cyclical, for both tribes and later Europeans. One raid demanded retaliation, and entire nations became trapped in blood feuds lasting generation after generation. And the scale was vastly larger than most people realize. Intertribal wars, and later wars with Europeans, weren't small, isolated clashes. They spanned centuries and covered the entire continent. Full-scale genocides occurred. In the 1600s, the Iroquois fought the Beaver Wars, destroying or displacing dozens of tribes across the Great Lakes and into Ohio. The Sioux expanded westward by crushing rival nations. Now, none of this means native societies were mindless killing machines. They built advanced cultures, had intricate diplomacy, and possessed survival skills beyond anything Europeans could imagine. But warfare played a central role for many tribes, and its brutality shocks modern sensibilities. That said, the violence wasn't universal. Some tribes lived relatively peacefully for long stretches. But when Spain, France, and Britain stepped onto the continent, they didn't find a serene Eden. They entered a landscape already filled with warring nations. Each colonial empire chose its allies, supplied tribes with weapons, and used them as proxies. The wars didn't decrease, they escalated. New alliances, new technology. Just fuel added to an old fire that burned for another 3 centuries. I'm a thorough researcher, but I'm not a professional historian. If I misinterpret anything significant, let me know, and I'll correct it in the description. Okay, so the Europeans brought with them a completely different moral framework and set of expectations, especially when it came to waging war. As they pushed deeper into the frontier, they carried the old world's rules of combat into a land that didn't operate by those standards. European armies wore uniforms, governments formally declared war, and battles were ideally fought between soldiers rather than civilians. There were written codes, long-standing customs, and understood boundaries, even if nations sometimes ignored them. Most European powers recognized similar conventions of warfare. But on the frontier, all of that collapsed. None of those rules applied in native warfare. And to the colonists, the way indigenous people fought looked disturbingly similar to what we would today label terrorism. There were no proclamations, no established front lines, no disciplined campaigns. A raiding party might ride out with 10 or 15 fighters, strike a homestead at sunrise, and disappear before anyone could respond. Sometimes they killed every person on the property. Other times they seized captives, people who would be enslaved, traded, or tortured. For settlers accustomed to European customs, it was horrifying. They came from a world where women and children were generally spared or considered off-limits. But on the frontier, they were often the earliest and most frequent casualties. On the flip side, native warriors viewed European-style warfare as bizarre. To them, colonial troops looked foolish marching in straight lines across open fields, guarding fixed fortifications, or refusing to fight during winter. Europeans would sign treaties, break them, then act shocked when their outposts were burned to the ground. The idea of surrender meant something entirely different in most tribes. It didn't guarantee mercy. It meant the defeated person belonged to the victors, to be ransomed, enslaved, or executed. The very concept of a white flag meant nothing. Even the understanding of land ownership clashed. Europeans saw land as something that could be bought, sold, fenced, farmed, and inherited. Tribes viewed land more like we think of the ocean, something you travel across, hunt within, and move through, but not something anyone can permanently own. Fencing off land and claiming it forever seemed absurd. Many tribes also held spiritual beliefs that heavily shaped their approach to battle. Warriors painted their bodies with sacred markings, carried charms, and believed spirits could make them immune to bullets. Sometimes those beliefs fueled extraordinary bravery. Other times, they led to disastrous decisions, like pushing forward when they shouldn't, or retreating from a fight they were winning because a sign or omen spooked them. Meanwhile, traditional European battle tactics were nearly useless on the frontier. You can't fight in neat formations against an enemy who refuses to stand still. And when militias did manage to catch up to a raiding party, the warriors rarely engaged. They scattered into the terrain, regrouped later, and attacked an unprotected settlement instead. Eventually, settlers understood that if they didn't adapt to this style of warfare, they would be wiped out. So they changed their methods. They started forming ranging companies, small, fast-moving units trained specifically for frontier combat. These weren't polished soldiers marching in perfect order. They were hunters, trackers, scouts, men who could fight the way their enemies fought. Over time, the largest of these groups evolved into the Texas Rangers, a completely restructured and battle-hardened force. The transformation was brutal. Soon, both sides began targeting civilians. Rangers learned to trail native war parties, strike quickly, and show no mercy. They burned fields to starve villages into surrender and collected scalps as trophies. The very practice that had repulsed them initially became part of their own warfare. Their retaliatory raids torched lodges, destroyed food supplies, and killed anyone they encountered. By the mid-1800s, settlers were abandoning the rules they once insisted on following. The clash between one culture's structured, soldier-to-soldier warfare and another culture's raiding style, which often targeted non-combatants, created a never-ending chain of atrocities. Every massacre justified another in return, and with no shared rules or common understanding of peace, the violence spiraled. Yet despite being massively outmatched in technology and population, native nations resisted fiercely. Many tribes held their ground for generations, and to really appreciate their military strength, it helps to focus on one nation in particular, a tribe that came to define the very essence of frontier warfare. By the late 1700s, the most feared military force west of the Mississippi wasn't British, French, or Spanish. It was the Comanche. And they completely reshaped the balance of power. At their height, an estimated 40,000 Comanche commanded a region roughly the size of present-day Texas, extending into New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas, and Oklahoma. For about a century and a half, they dominated the southern plains so thoroughly that many historians refer to their domain as an empire, not a centralized state like European nations, but a powerful network that determined who lived, who traded, who traveled, and who controlled resources from the Rockies down to central Texas. They transformed the southern plains into a sphere of influence where anyone passing through owed them tribute. Communities in New Mexico paid them off regularly just to survive. Ranches in Texas lost thousands of cattle and horses every year. Even other tribes surrendered goods or livestock as protection payments to avoid being annihilated. Their greatest advantage, the thing that propelled them into legendary status, was their absolute mastery of the horse. When the Spanish introduced horses to the Americas, most tribes treated them like farm animals. The Comanche turned them into instruments of war. They were always formidable fighters, but horses amplified their abilities beyond anything the world had seen on this continent. They stole vast numbers of them, bred them in enormous herds, and developed combat techniques on horseback that no other tribe or European cavalry could match. Comanche boys grew up on horses. From childhood, they trained to ride at full speed, make sharp turns, shoot from impossible angles, and use the animal itself as a shield. When they went into battle, eyewitnesses were stunned by what they witnessed. Warriors could race forward at a full gallop, then drop to the side of the horse and hang beneath its neck, shooting arrows from beneath the animal's body. From that position, they could release 20 arrows per minute and kill a man from 30 yards away, all while remaining almost invisible behind the horse's bulk. It was a revolutionary style of mounted warfare that no one else ever mastered. But their dominance didn't stem only from mobility. It also came from their cultural values, which embraced warfare as a path to honor, reputation, and adulthood. All those brutal elements mentioned earlier, raiding, torture, scalping, were deeply embedded in Comanche life. Young men gained status through war. That was how you earned your name, your standing, your future. Violence wasn't a burden. It was the pathway to everything meaningful. Historians often compare them to the Mongols of the Great Steppe. Relentless, fast, highly skilled, and feared by every neighboring people. Their reputation was so fierce that few dared defy them. In 1840, the Comanche unleashed what became known as the Great Raid, a legendary campaign. Warriors rode hundreds of miles into Mexico, razing entire villages, seizing thousands of horses, and dragging numerous captives northward. The destruction was so overwhelming that northern Mexico essentially collapsed. If you've ever wondered why Spanish culture and language are dominant south of the Rio Grande but not north of it, historians often point to one major reason: the Comanche. Their power shaped the border as we know it. Still, even for a nation as powerful as they were, expanding while constantly on the move was difficult. Captives made up between 10 and 25% of Comanche society. Nearly every household kept slaves, mostly native or Mexican captives, and many were sold in markets in Santa Fe and Taos. Some captives were absorbed into families, others were treated strictly as property, and sometimes the line between adoption and enslavement blurred. One of the most famous examples was Cynthia Ann Parker. She was only 9 years old when Comanche warriors attacked her family's fort in Texas, killing others and carrying her away alive. As with many young captives, she assimilated completely, given a new name, raised within the tribe, and later married a chief. 24 years later, the Texas Rangers finally located and rescued her. But what happened next shocked the public. It wasn't a joyful reunion. Cynthia Ann didn't recognize her relatives. She couldn't speak English anymore, and she had no desire to leave her Comanche family. She fought, screamed, and tried to escape. What the Rangers viewed as salvation, she experienced as kidnapping. Her identity, her loyalty, her sense of belonging, all of it lay with the Comanche. Texans interpreted her story as evidence of Comanche brutality. The Comanche saw it as a normal, honored adoption. She had 3 children with her Comanche husband, including a son, Quanah Parker, who would later become the last and arguably the greatest chief the Comanche Nation ever had. For decades, the U.S. Army struggled hopelessly against the Comanche. Conventional tactics were completely ineffective. Chasing them across the plains left soldiers exhausted, starving, and frequently ambushed. One officer compared it to fighting ghosts. But after many years, the Comanche power began to weaken. Warfare and disease reduced their numbers dramatically. New American weapons, especially repeating rifles, shifted the balance. And the constant arrival of settlers meant the U.S. had more manpower and resources to keep fighting. Commercial buffalo hunters, backed quietly by the U.S. Army, were slaughtering bison herds at an astonishing rate. In just over 10 years, they wiped out roughly 30 million buffalo, destroying the Comanche's primary food source and the foundation of their way of life. In 1874, Quanah Parker led a final desperate attack on the trading post at Adobe Walls. It failed. The next step was devastating. Colonel Ranald Mackenzie launched a ruthless campaign, burning the Comanche's winter stores, destroying their lodges, and killing more than 1,000 of their horses. That winter, starving, outgunned, and unable to replace their losses, the last free Comanche bands surrendered. Their century-long reign as the rulers of the plains was over. Still, for more than 100 years, they were the dominant military force of the American West, and the terror they inspired was not irrational. Look, I just compressed an entire empire into a few minutes. But if you want a deeper understanding, I highly recommend the book that inspired this video, Comanches, The History of a People. I read it years ago, and both the story and the tribe stayed with me. It's the only book I've ever read that literally gave me nightmares. Once you see the frontier through its lens, those old Hollywood cowboy and Indian films feel like children's cartoons. I've dropped a link below. Most of us like our stories simple, heroes in white hats, villains in black. But the American frontier didn't work that way. The brutality came from every direction. By modern standards, it's almost unimaginable. I could tell countless stories from both sides. A Mormon militia disguised as natives murdered 120 civilians. Tucson settlers and their allies slaughtered more than 100 peaceful Apache, mostly women and children. Comanche fighters stormed Fort Parker and raped women before killing them. During the Minnesota Uprising of 1862, Dakota warriors killed over 600 settlers, including infants. When it came to treaties, both sides broke them whenever it suited them. For many tribes, a treaty simply meant a temporary pause before the next raiding season. But those violations were tiny compared to the sheer scale of treaty breaking by European settlers and the U.S. government. The federal government negotiated over 500 treaties and effectively violated every single one. Even after all this, it's clear neither narrative, noble settlers conquering savages or peaceful natives crushed by villains, tells the full truth. It was two formidable cultures smashing into each other until one ended up with better weapons and overwhelming population numbers. Looking at those numbers, figuring out population sizes and casualty estimates is incredibly difficult for historians. One major challenge is that many indigenous groups didn't keep written records, which means much of the information has to be pieced together from archaeology, oral histories, and early European accounts. Still, most estimates place the pre-Columbus native population at around 10 million people, though some scholars argue for much higher or lower figures. For a long time, the European population on the continent was smaller than that. It wasn't until the early 1800s, after massive waves of immigration, that Europeans began to outnumber indigenous peoples. As for the number of deaths during conflicts, those are even harder to calculate. Battle casualties blur together with deaths from starvation, exposure, and disease, because these factors were tightly intertwined. War destroyed food stores, disease spread in weakened communities, and famine killed as reliably as bullets. But most historians agree that hundreds of thousands of Native Americans were killed in the centuries-long struggle, and tens of thousands of Europeans also lost their lives. Yet despite the staggering violence, the leading cause of Native American deaths wasn't warfare at all. It was biological. The deadliest weapon wasn't the bow, musket, or scalping knife. It was something almost nobody at the time even understood: germs. European diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza tore through indigenous populations with catastrophic results. For thousands of years, Europeans had lived in dense settlements near domesticated animals, the original source of many infectious diseases. Each outbreak had killed the vulnerable, but left survivors with stronger immunity, and those survivors passed their genetic resistance to their descendants. Native Americans had no such inherited protections. When these pathogens arrived, they caused devastation on an unimaginable scale. Scholars estimate that diseases caused between 60% and 90% of all indigenous deaths after European contact. Entire tribes vanished in a matter of months. Whole regions became depopulated. Some villages were wiped out without a single shot fired. And despite one infamous incident in 1763, when British officers discussed giving smallpox-infected blankets to hostile tribes, disease was almost never deployed intentionally. It spread uncontrollably on its own. European settlers, armies, and traders viewed these epidemics not as war tactics, but as fate, divine will, or simply a tragic consequence of contact. In the bigger picture, disease was one part of a massive, drawn-out collision between civilizations. A conflict that played out like a multi-generational feud where each side believed the same story about themselves. We're the victims. They're the aggressors. They struck first. We have to finish this. The real history of the frontier is the story of two worlds that could not coexist, locked in a centuries-long war where mercy was rare and civilians usually paid the highest price. If you want to honor Native Americans, don't turn them into flawless heroes or helpless perpetual victims, because they were neither. They were powerful, resourceful, adaptable, and at times ruthless. and so were the settlers who fought them. History doesn't fold neatly into moral categories. The deeper you dig, the more complicated and unsettling it becomes. And sometimes you don't even need to look far back to find shocking truths. For instance, why do so many modern conflicts use child soldiers? When I looked into that question, I was stunned by the answer, because in many wars, child soldiers actually offer strategic advantages, not moral ones of course, but cold, tactical strengths commanders exploit. It's horrifying, but undeniably effective. Just something to think about. Anyway, that's the quiet truth people usually ignore. Thanks for watching. I appreciate you staying with me all the way to the end. If this video gave you something new to think about, or helped shed light on a part of history that's often overlooked, please take a moment to support the channel. Like the video, leave a comment, share it with someone who'd enjoy it, and don't forget to subscribe to Echoes Beneath for more deep dives into the stories hidden beneath the surface. Your support truly makes a difference. See you in the next one.